Hi class, today we're going to be looking at Chapter 2, the continuing payroll problem. You should be able to see on your screen Chapter 2, continuing payroll problem. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to work on a partial payroll problem during this chapter, and then we're going to continue with it for the future chapters. And so we're going to start by completing a partial payroll register, which is nothing more than a spreadsheet. And I'm going to show you how to do that. I think it's important that you would read your instructions carefully and look at what they want you to complete for this particular problem. I'm not going to take the time to read those for you. I think you can do that. And so I'm going to let you do that. What they've given us is an hourly wage and salary report, which shows the name of each employee and the amount that they make. Notice these employees, some of them are paid by the hour, some of them are paid by the week, some of them are paid per month, and then one is paid by the year. So make sure you take into consideration how many times the employee is paid before you would fill out this payroll register. We also have a clerk's report, which is nothing more than a list of the employees and the amount of time that they worked. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing this for the period ending January 8th. It's a weekly report that they're doing, and so we're going to base our figures on weekly pay. Here's the instructions for starting the payroll register. And so when you open your payroll register in Cengage, some of these things are going to be filled in for you. And so some of the things that you are going to have to work on is completing the rate per hour, and also you're going to have to complete the amount of the regular earnings. Notice these have columns up here showing you the number of hours that are worked for each employee, their regular rate of pay, and the amount that they earn. Notice that the first 5 of these employees is paid hourly. So we need to know the hourly rates before we can determine the regular earnings amount. But if they're paid monthly, then what we need to do is convert their amounts to a monthly amount, or we would also have to convert the amount per year. Notice they've given you per week for a couple of these, and they didn't write them down in the payroll register, and that's because we just plug them in for the regular earnings amount, the weekly amounts. Now you'll have to find the weekly amount for the monthly salaried persons. And the way we do that is we take the amount that is given to us, if it's monthly, we annualize the wages, and then we divide it by 52 weeks to get these regular earnings amounts. And that's how we would come up with these. But basically, the payroll register, this is a partial one. It certainly isn't finished all the way. But it's partially complete for you, and you just have to fill in the blanks. So let's start with the first employee, and let's see what's happening with him. First of all, this is his name, and his filing status is single. Now, right now, we haven't talked much about filing statuses, but as we go through, we need to know what the filing status is when we figure out income taxes. That won't be happening in this chapter, but will be happening in a later chapter. So this is given information that they gave to you, and the number of withholding allowances is not applicable in this problem. And so I just put n/a for each one of those because you're not going to apply it in this particular problem. What you will have to write down is the hours worked. And you're getting the hours worked from the weekly time clerk's report. And for Robert, he worked 40 hours. So this 40 hours would be plugged into the payroll register. And the same is true for all of the workers. Now, if you look at Inga Flores, her total time is 50 hours. And anything above 50 hours, anything above 40 hours will be considered overtime. So when you're calculating regular earnings, you just put down 40 hours for regular earnings. Or if they did less than 40 hours, you'd record less than the 40 hours, as was the case with Palmetto. The rest of these, we're considering 40-hour a normal work week, and anything above 40 hours, they would pay at time and a half the regular rate. So for Rob, the first one that we're looking at, he worked a total of 40 hours. There were no overtime that we'd have to calculate for him. What they did is they gave us the regular earnings rate, and that earnings rate came from here. Again, this is the given information from the the hourly wage and salary report. You see he made $18.50 per hour. And so we're just going to plug in $18.50 here under the regular rate. Multiply the regular rate by 40 hours, and that gives you his regular earnings. Since there were no overtime earnings for this employee, the total earnings is equal to the regular earnings. At least that's what it is at this point. Again, we haven't finished calculating this payroll register. This is as far as I believe they wanted us to go. Yeah, they just wanted you to go to total earnings. Sorry, I'm trying to get this on our screen where we can see it all at one time. I know I'm flipping back and forth a whole lot, but this is about the best I can do for you. All right, the next employee is Inga Flores. She worked 50 hours. We got that from the clerk's report. 40 hours goes in for regular earnings. Notice we're in the regular earnings column here. So she worked 40 hours and she was paid $19.25. You would multiply 40 times $19.25, and that will give you the regular earnings. Since she worked 10 hours overtime, she worked a total of 50 hours. 40 was regular and 10 was overtime hours. We're going to have to figure out what our overtime rate is. So since we know that they gave us the hourly wages of certain employees, we're going to take her hourly wage of 19.25. We're going to multiply it by 1.5 times, and that will give us the hourly overtime rate. So the overtime rate here is calculated at 19.25 times 1.5. Then we're going to take the overtime rate and we're going to multiply it by 10 hours worked in overtime, and that'll give us the overtime earnings for that particular employee. You're going to combine your overtime earnings with your regular earnings for the employee to get the total earnings of that employee. I've also shown you down here at the bottom how we calculated the overtime calculations, and you might have noticed for Inga Flores, if we took the 740 and divided it by 40 hours, it doesn't give us, it gives us 1850, But if we take 1850 and we multiply it by 1.5, it gives us a amount that we carry out 3 decimal places, and then we round it back to 2 decimal places, and that's how we get in the $28.88. That 5 is more. It makes the 7 go up to 8, so $28.88 is the overtime rate. You're going to use the rounded up amount to multiply by the number of overtime hours, and that'll give you the overtime earnings. Once you have the overtime earnings, then what we're going to do is we're going to take our regular earnings and add the overtime earnings to that, and that will give you this total earnings for Flores. On the next person, they worked less than 40 hours. They worked 38.5 hours, and they worked at a rate of $17.80. That was given to you. We multiply 38.5 times 17.8, and that will give you $685.30, and that would also be the total earnings for this particular employee. The next employee, Randy Waters, worked 47 hours. 40 hours is his regular hours worked. We multiply 40 hours times the given amount for our regular earnings, and that gives us the regular earnings amount. Then what we would do is we would take this $20.70, we would multiply it by time and a half, and for Randy, that gives us $31.05. And that $31.05 is what we plugged in for the overtime rate for Randy. And then we're going to multiply that by 7 hours in overtime. That gives you the overtime earnings. And then we'll simply add the regular earnings and the overtime earnings together. For Kathy, she's also an hourly employee, and Kathy worked a total of 40 hours. So we simply multiply 40 hours times $23.80 to get the regular earnings amount, and that is the total earnings because she did not complete any overtime hours. When we get to Rupert, you need to look back because there's no hourly rate here. So we need to look back at what they told us in the given information for Rupert. Rupert was paid $800 per week. So if we want to know the hourly amount, we've got to take 800 and divide it by 52 to get the hourly rate. And that hourly rate then would be multiplied by 1.5 times to get the overtime rate of $30. So in other words, I've got it figured for you here, down here below. 800 was his weekly amount divided by 40 regular hours, and then you multiply that by 1.5 times, and that gave you $30 an hour. That's your overtime rate. You multiply your overtime rate by your overtime hours, and this person, whose name was Rupert, they're telling you that Rupert worked 41.25 hours. So 1.25 hours, or 1.25 hours, is your overtime hours. So 1.25 times $30 overtime rate gives you $37.50 in your overtime. Overtime plus the regular earnings gives you the total earnings. For William Scott, you'll notice that he's not an hourly employee, so we need to refer back to our information that was given. Scott makes $780 a week. So to find the hourly amount of overtime rate, we would need to take this weekly amount, divide it by 40 hours, and then multiply it by 1.5, and that would give you the overtime rate for Scott. But notice that Scott didn't work any overtime, so we don't have to worry about uh, calculating any overtime hours for Scott, but we did for Rupert. So his regular earnings are just the total earnings for Scott because there were no overtime hours. Okay, for Wickman, he's paid $3,500 per month. Before we can find the hourly amount of the overtime rate, we have to convert this to an annual amount, and then we convert the annual amount to a weekly amount, and then we convert the weekly amount to an hourly amount. And once we get the hourly amount, we'll multiply it by 1.5 times to get the overtime rate. So you got to figure your overtime rate. What was given to us is that she made $3,500 per month. And so if you look right here, she didn't have any overtime hours. How did we know that? Because on the clerk's report, when we look at Wickman, she only worked 40 hours. So we didn't have to worry about doing the overtime for that. We did have to figure out what her weekly amount of earnings would be. So all you have to do is you take the monthly amount that was given, multiply it by 12 to get the annual amount, and then divide the annual amount by 52 weeks in a year, and that will give you the weekly amount. The weekly amount, since there was no overtime, is the total earnings for this employee. For Foley, you notice that I can see here from the payroll register that he had 45 hours. We're going to have to pay him 5 hours in overtime. But before we do that, we need to take a look at how many times he is paid. Foley is paid per month. So we got to annualize our wages by multiplying that 4,500 times 12 and then dividing it by 52 weeks in a year. Once we get the annual amount, divide it by 52 weeks. That'll give you the weekly amount. Divide the weekly amount by 40 hours, and that'll give you the hourly amount. And then once you have the hourly amount, multiply the hourly amount times 1.5, and that will give you the overtime rate. And you can see how I've calculated that here. So I took my weekly amount, evidently, and I divided it by 40 hours, and then I figured out what my hourly amount was and multiplied it by 1.5, and that gave me $38.94. So $38.94 times 5 hours in overtime gives you total overtime hours, earnings of $194.70. This plus this is added together to get your total earnings. For Masha only, notice they gave her per year amount. So we're going to have to make this a weekly amount. So we would take 78,000 divided by 52, and that would give us our weekly amount of 1,500. Since she just worked 40 hours, there was no overtime hours that we had to work with. So to get the 1,500, we would take the annual amount divided by 52. And that is the total earnings for only, excuse me. Then what you're going to do is you're going to add up your total regular earnings, and you're going to add up your total overtime earnings. And when you add both of these together, that'll give you the total of the earnings, or you could add it straight down as a way to see a systems of checks and balances for this problem. So that's all there is to this first part of the continuing payroll problem. You need to do this first, and we're going to continue with this very same thing that you answered, in the next chapter. So make sure you save this somewhere, save your computations so you'll have it again. And you can convert it to Excel like I did if you wanted to. Um, it doesn't make any difference to me, but you do have to put it into Cengage. So just want to make sure you understand that. So we'll stop sharing with you, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.